For a long time, Mrs. Lourdes had no hope of a miracle. She knew she would never be able to start over, change something, and ask forgiveness from those she had offended, consciously or unconsciously. The elderly woman lived a life full of events and did not regret the years that passed. She loved and was loved, had sorrows and unjustified hopes, but also experienced much happiness. Mrs. Lourdes married early. Her parents were simple workers. One day, she met Bento. By chance, he was a student and grew up in an intellectual family. The young couple fell in love at first sight and soon got married. Mrs. Lourdes took good care of her distracted husband, completely immersed in writing books, and he greatly appreciated her care, calling her his guardian angel. Bento's career took off. His books were loved by readers and published in increasing numbers. Soon, the family bought a beautiful house in a prestigious suburb and moved to the quiet place so necessary for writing. By that time, the couple already had 2 children, Alan and Daniela. The couple lived together for 50 years, and then Bento fell ill and quietly passed away during sleep. By then, their children had already formed their own families and lived separately. After her husband's death, Mrs. Lourdes was completely alone, not knowing where to direct her energy, and now she was 80 years old. A few days ago, she felt a sharp weakness and was hospitalized for medical examinations. Mrs. Lourdes was not afraid of death but dreamed of quietly passing away in her sleep, just like her husband. Alan and Daniela went to visit their mother and found her in a state of introspection about her life. "Hi, Mom, how are you feeling?" Daniela asked, kissing her mother. "I'm alive, and that's good," Mrs. Lourdes replied, smiling. "Mom, why don't we take you back home? Maybe you'll feel better there," Alan suggested. "Alan, I don't think anything can help me anymore," the elderly woman replied sadly. "Besides, I don't want to go back to an empty house again. It's not so uplifting here among people." "If you want, we can hire a nurse at any time," said Alan discontentedly. Daniela and Alan stayed a little longer and then quickly left the hospital. The elderly woman felt a little hurt that her own children hadn't invited her to stay with them, being willing to entrust the care of their mother to strangers. After lying there for a while, Mrs. Lourdes decided to take a short walk outside to get some fresh air. She left the room and went to the hallway. It was quiet and deserted. Suddenly, she heard muffled crying coming from a room. She opened the door and saw a young, pale woman lying in a bed, connected to all kinds of machines. A boy of about 12 years old was sitting beside her, holding the hand of the sick woman. He sobbed bitterly. It was obvious that he was trying to contain himself, but he couldn't. Mrs. Lourdes quietly approached the boy and asked what had happened. The boy trembled and, between tears, said that his mother was dying. Mrs. Lourdes sat down beside him and asked him to tell the story. Rael and his mother, Tatiana, had lived alone for as long as he could remember. His mother worked as a hairdresser in a beauty salon and also did hairstyles for clients at home to support herself and her son. She took any part-time job and became very tired. Rael felt sorry for his mother with all his heart and tried to please her in every possible way. He did well in school, helped at home, and even learned to cook. But one day, an accident happened. On the way back from work, his exhausted mother was crossing the street and didn't notice a car approaching at high speed. The car hit her head-on. The woman was taken to the hospital, where the doctors did everything they could, but she fell into a coma. There were some hospitals that could help, but the treatment and surgery were very expensive, and they didn't have the money. Moreover, the queue for free surgery was very long. Rael was very worried that his mother wouldn't survive. Mrs. Lourdes comforted the boy as best she could, then slowly returned to her room, thinking about how unfair life could be. The young woman had never known anything but work in her life, and now her son could be without a mother the next day before his treatments. Mrs. Lourdes stopped in the room to see Rael and his mother on the way back to her room. She heard the loud voices of Alan and Daniela arguing, rude, angry. Mrs. Lourdes was shocked and stopped at the door. She had never imagined that her children, always friendly and calm, would argue. So, at that moment, she heard Alan's voice. "Why do you think the country house should be yours? I am the oldest son and heir. For centuries, the house has always been left to the son." Daniela replied indignantly, "No way. You have 2 children and I have 3, so the house is mine and everything in it too. Take the apartment, and I will give you half of our parents' savings." But her brother didn't give up. "You don't need to do favors for me. I already have the right to half of my father's copyright royalties. I will sue you for every penny when our mother dies. So, let's see who gets what." Mrs. Lourdes stepped away from the door, unable to bear the hatred emanating from the room. She was horrified to think that her children were fighting this way while she was still alive. Suddenly, she remembered her children's behavior before the hospital, compared it to what she had heard occasionally, and then realized that they never came just to find out how their mother was feeling or to see if she needed help and support. They only visited when she was receiving royalties from her husband's books. It was at that moment that Mrs. Lourdes realized how blind her maternal love had been, as she had never noticed anything before. The woman entered the room resolutely, and Alan and Daniela fell silent. Immediately, the anger vanished from their faces, and a tense, fake smile appeared. This remarkable change made Mrs. Lourdes smile. She immediately asked her son to call the family lawyer and invite him to the hospital tomorrow to make a will. Alan and Daniela began to convince their mother that she would live for a long time and that it was too early to think about the will, but she interrupted their disguised speeches and asked to let her rest now and come back the next morning to be present when the will was drawn up. The brother and sister, exchanging greedy looks, adjusted their mother's pillow, kissed her, and left silently, closing the door of the room. Mrs. Lourdes merely shook her head disapprovingly, surprised by such a transformation. At exactly 10 o'clock the next day, the lawyer entered the room with firm steps. He began to spread the papers, and Alan and Daniela anxiously awaited the fateful decision. When the lawyer was ready to take notes, Mrs. Lourdes smiled and began to make her will. She left $100,000 to each of her children, and ordered $150,000 to be transferred to an account of a clinic for surgical treatment and rehabilitation of Rael's mother. She also bequeathed the countryside house to Rael and his mother. Then, Mrs. Lourdes ordered the city apartment to be sold, and the profits to be divided equally among all her grandchildren, even though they had never visited since they grew up. The elderly woman hoped they had grown as insensitive as she was. Daniela and Alan began to shout, claiming it wasn't fair. They believed they would invalidate her will, as it was clear she wasn't in her right mind. When Mrs. Lourdes asked the lawyer if she had the right to dispose of her assets as she pleased, he said everything was legal, and if her children thought she was incapacitated, the hospital could easily verify it with the help of authorized specialists. Angry, Alan and Daniela defiantly left the hospital room. Mrs. Lourdes sadly smiled at the lawyer. "You see, this is how a mother's love ends. Thank you, you must do your best to transfer the money to the clinic as soon as possible. I've told the doctor to start negotiations." The lawyer left, and Mrs. Lourdes went to the room with Rael and his mother. The boy was reading a book aloud to her. The woman, although out of her coma, was still very weak. Rael and Tatiana, the elderly woman, told them, "Listen carefully, I'm old but I feel strong enough to help you. In about a week, we will all go together to a good clinic where Tatiana will receive everything she needs to recover. My lawyer will take care of everything, is that right?" the excited boy asked. "You heard, Mom, Mrs. Lourdes is going to help us." "Thank you," was the only whisper Tatiana managed to pronounce, smiling. It had been a long time since the elderly woman felt that someone needed her, but now her soul warmed with the idea that, at least before dying, she could do something good and perform one more good deed. A year passed. Mrs. Lourdes was in her countryside house, listening to Rael talk about his achievements in school, and Tatiana, happy and healthy, looked at him with joy. How wonderful, Mrs. Lourdes thought. I'm no longer alone, I have loved ones who need me, who truly love me, and that's true happiness. The elderly woman was happy for 5 whole years with Tatiana and Rael, her children and grandchildren. They never visited again. Mrs. Lourdes left this world just as she had dreamed, silently while sleeping, with Tatiana and Rael by her side, listening to her last breath and remembering her fondly and lovingly for the rest of their lives. If you enjoyed this story, please leave your opinion in the comments, and of course, like and subscribe. Turn on notifications so you don't miss any videos. A big hug and see you soon.